Most people think negotiation is about winning deals or getting better terms, but today's guest shows us it's actually about something deeper: the ability to navigate conflict, influence calmly, and make decisions that shape the direction of your life and wealth. Dr. Joshua Weiss is a world renowned negotiation and conflict resolution expert, senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project, co founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative, and director of the MS in Leadership and Negotiation at Bay Path University. In this episode, we uncover the science and psychology behind negotiation and why the people who master it create more freedom, stronger relationships, and better outcomes in every area of life. Josh, welcome to MyFinJourney.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. You're too kind. So Josh, I wanted to start by understanding your path and how exactly you became an expert in negotiation and conflict resolution.
Sure. Well, it was not at all linear. That much I can say.
I
But
love it.
yeah, well, it was great stuff. And I think it taught me that, in life you have ideas and thoughts, and most of them don't end up going the way you imagine. So you have to keep adapting and adjusting and kind of going with the flow. Um, I was a history major in college and was not 100% sure what I wanted to do. I kind of did study the Vietnam War and World War II and the Holocaust and things like that. But what ended up happening was actually that I went and worked. My mother was actually Canadian, so I went and worked at a family business for a year to see if I wanted to do that, and didn't quite unfold the way I imagined. So I decided to come home and not do that. But before I was leaving, a friend of mine called me and said, how's it going? And I said, it's all right, but I think this isn't what I'm supposed to do with my life. And I said, how are you? What's going on? And he said, I just bought a round the world ticket. I'm going backpacking for a year. I said, really? That sounds pretty interesting. And he said, yeah, why? Do you want to go? And I, without even thinking about it, I said, absolutely. So I got home, I sold everything I owned. I had about $16,000 or so to my name. I bought a round the world ticket, which was, like at the time, this was 1991, 92, was about 1,500 US dollars. So not too expensive. And you could just keep going west as long as you did that. And so I left and I went and backpacked for a year, and it was something that completely changed my perspective on life, on the world, and actually on conflict. I found that one of the themes that I kept encountering was conflict. And so when I got back, I thought, I realize I'm just one person here, but I feel like I need to do something to make a difference and to try to deal with the problems and challenges that I saw around the world. And so I applied to graduate school, got into a university in Washington, D.C. called American University, and into their international relations program. And they said, well, you need to pick a concentration. And I said, okay. And they sent me a brochure because back then that's what we did. You didn't go online then. I looked into it and was looking at the different foci and saw peace and conflict resolution, and it kind of flew off the page and hit me. And I said, that's what I want to do. And I started down that road, and I had one of my the director of the program and one of my most favorite professors, a guy named Abdul Aziz Saeed, who's originally from Syria, a Sufi. And he would tell these unbelievable stories as Sufis do. And I was mesmerized and I was fascinated by what I was learning. And so I really started digging in and learned more and more about conflict resolution and nonviolence and negotiation. And then at the time, I actually happened to be dating somebody, and she lived in Boston, where I grew up. And so I moved back from there to Boston and started working at the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. And that only further sort of lit my fire when it came to negotiation. I just found it really fascinating. And I looked around and noticed that everybody who was doing something that was really interesting was either doing a law degree or either had a law degree or a PhD. And I tried law, and or I, sort of did a few things to see if I might like that. And it really wasn't my style. So I did a PhD, and I went back to the Washington, D.C. area in George Mason University and got my PhD in conflict analysis and resolution, and then came back around and started working at Harvard with a colleague, William Urey, and we still run the program that you mentioned today. And I have my own consulting company as well. So do a lot of work with so many different groups and entities and industries, you name it. And I think that's what I love about negotiation and conflict is it's ubiquitous, and everybody needs to learn how to do this in order to succeed. And so I deeply believe that. And I would say, I guess my life's mission is to try to get this knowledge and skills to as many people as I can, because I've seen how it's changed my life, and I've seen how it's changed so many others.
So, Josh, that's really powerful. You mentioned that it's ubiquitous. You mentioned that everyone can benefit from upskilling when it comes to conflict resolution, when it comes to negotiating. Can you just give us one example, something powerful that really hits home for you, where the things you've learned have actually been you've been able to apply it in your life?
Well, I mean, well, first of all, I mean, it's helped me to manage a lot of different workplace situations. Working with different people, you're constantly having to resolve conflicts with people that you work with, that you engage with, that you need to do different kinds of things. So I think that's, perhaps an obvious one. And the organizations that I've worked with over the years, the ones that are really great and people stay and they love what they do are the ones that have found a way to help people learn to deal with conflict effectively. One of the biggest challenges that companies have is conflicts go unresolved, avoided, etc. And one of my favorite sayings is conflict, unlike wine, does not age well. And so you have to really address it and learn to deal with it. And I think, unfortunately, there's a stigma that goes along with conflict, which is that it's a very negative thing when it arises. And I actually don't believe that. Conflict happens all the time. It's kind of, in my mind, it's a natural part of the decision making process. When you and I sit down to do something, to work on something, to find a way forward related to whatever it is that we're doing, it's very likely we have different views, different perspectives. We come from different backgrounds. So it's almost strange when we don't conflict in some way, shape, or form. And what makes conflict positive or negative is actually how you deal with it. When people learn the skills of dealing with conflict and learn to view conflict as kind of a natural thing that happens, then you get into problem solving mode and you say, okay, so, this conflict is pointing at something that's not working. And so how are we going to fix it? And that's how I view conflict. And I think part of it is if you can get people to see things that way. And as an aside, so much of dealing with conflict, of negotiating, is your mindset and how you view what it is that you're doing. And too often people have been told a story, or they've experienced things that have been very destructive. And so that baggage comes with them as part of that. And I will also say, I use this at home with my spouse, and I have three daughters who I've subtly taught these skills and knowledge to. And I see them using this out in the world. One of them is in sports broadcasting. And so she has to kind of have an agent and work with them and figure out what she wants. And another is going to be a therapist and absolutely uses the skills that we've talked about. So, I mean, I've used it everywhere. And the more that I do this, the more I feel and see how valuable it is for everyone to understand. I can think of a lot of conflicts that were having a significant impact on my life. And, when I ultimately resolved them, I strengthened the relationship and dealt with whatever it was that was difficult. And that's a feeling that I know most people can relate to. And so my hope is that people can learn to take a different view of all of this.
I love that, Josh. Very powerful response. I'd be curious to kind of understand when you look at the environment today, the political environment, the geopolitical environment, it feels as though over the last couple years, things have just become very polarizing. And I'd love to kind of understand your perspective on that from a history lens, from a negotiating lens, from a psychological perspective. Help us understand why things have become that way, and maybe how we should deal with conflict more efficiently.
So there's no question that things have become more polarized. And I think part of the reason for that, why dealing with these things are so difficult, is because a lot of the issues that we're talking about are go right to the heart of our identity, of who we are. So if I talk to somebody who I have a political disagreement with, for example, if I'm asking them to change or to see things from my point of view, I'm asking them to do something a lot harder than it sounds. I'm asking them to kind of reevaluate how they view the world and how they see things. And a lot of that goes right to who we are as a human being and as a person. So I think, polarization often also comes from fear, and it's interesting because fear is usually a motivator in a lot of conflict. We're afraid of lots of things. And in fact, when I'm dealing with a very difficult person, I often try to think to myself, what are they afraid of? As opposed to this person's a real jerk. And it helps me to kind of get a better sense of what might be a concern and a worry or a fear. And by the way, when it comes to negotiating or things along those lines, a lot of times we have hidden dimensions to what's happening. When it comes to negotiation or conflict, people often will put their position out there, right? This is what I want. What we really need to do is understand what their underlying interests and needs are, because those are the things that are motivating them. And those things are usually hidden. It's a little bit like, if you want to do this well, it's a little bit like being an investigative journalist. You have to, there's the headline story that you see, right? That says, this is what I want. But why somebody wants that is really the key. And it opens doors to handling conflict and negotiating more effectively. But the problem is, much of the time we don't get there, and we don't think to ask questions. When we think about the best negotiators or the best conflict resolvers, a lot of people think they're the smoothest talkers, or um, you know they're always seeking to persuade. And really, the best negotiators I've worked with, they certainly seek to persuade, but they start by understanding that they're always working with incomplete information. And so they ask a lot of good questions and really listen carefully to what's coming back at them, because information is the currency of negotiating and dealing with conflict. The more we have, the better off we are, and the more we understand what's driving the other person and their behavior. So I think it's one of those things where, conflict and negotiation are not what people tend to think they are. The popular media and others tell us a story of how you should negotiate. But most of the time, from my point of view, it's wrong. I genuinely believe that, for example, we often talk about here in the US about compromise, and that good negotiation always requires compromise. And I would actually say that compromise is a lazy way to negotiate. Um, people, when people run up against a difficult problem or a difficult challenge in negotiation, most people quickly run to the notion of, okay, well, let's split the difference, or let's compromise on this. And what they ought to be doing is really getting into problem solving mode and saying, what's the problem we're dealing with? And what are the different ways that we can try to manage this? And, 5 years ago, I wrote a book called The Book of Real World Negotiations, and it's case studies. And what you find when you pick it up is actually there's very little compromise, because people got on down to those underlying interests and got into problem solving mode. And really, we're focusing much more on what's the creative solution that we can find here to address these underlying interests, not what do we each have to give up. Because it shouldn't be much of a newsflash to your listeners that if you go into something thinking, I have to give up something really important in order to reach agreement, you're not going to like negotiation, because who wants to give up something of great value to them? Not many people. So for me, I feel like people have learned a story about negotiation. They've also learned a story about conflict, and that there's, you know, I have to be confrontational in order to deal with a conflict. No, you have to have a conversation, and you have to really listen carefully to what is going on for the other side, because this is an interdependent process. I need you to say yes for me to get where I want to go, and vice versa. So when people often say to me, well, that's your problem. When you figure it out, let me know. I think to myself, this person doesn't really know how to negotiate or deal with conflict very well, because that's not how this works.
Josh, I feel like you've said a lot of powerful things. You touched on the value of negotiating and conflict resolution with respect to marriage. Just now, you're talking about how compromise is lazy. Before I get how compromising is a bit lazy with respect to negotiating, before I dive deeper into these two topics, I want to pause for a second and tell the audience, if you're listening to this episode and it's already helping you rethink negotiations, hit subscribe. Every week, we share transformative stories from experts like Josh and strategies that ultimately help you build wealth, clarity, and confidence. If you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share it with a friend so that they can also get value. So, Josh, I wanted to start by maybe scrolling back a little bit and really diving deeper on this idea of marriage, an idea of how, not compromise, but how negotiations and conflict resolution is ubiquitous, with the subtext that divorce rates are very high in the US and globally. And also, MyFinJourney is all about finance. So, divorce is also very expensive in most situations. But also, there's a huge emotional toll to divorce that people in finance typically don't talk about. And I feel like, given your skill set in negotiations and conflict resolution, you're probably more acutely aware of the emotional toll and mental bandwidth that these types of conversations take. From my perspective, people compromise not only because they're lazy per se, but because the work is very difficult, and it's very difficult to do something that you don't understand how to do. So with that, Josh, I want to kind of understand from your perspective, why do so many people get divorced? Is it a breakdown in negotiation and conflict resolution, or is there some other key underlying factor?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert in marriage, so I'll just put that out there.
I don't think anyone is.
No, I mean, I've been married for 25 years, so that gives me a little street cred, I guess. But look, I think it's critically important to communicate, and too often people just don't. They don't say what they feel and think because they think it's better not to hurt the other person's feelings in that way. But spouses have to be able to talk. They have to be able to say, this is bothering me, this is a challenge. I know, for example, with my wife, when we were dating, and this would have sounded strange coming from anybody else, but I said, listen, I'm very curious, how do you think you deal with conflict? And she said, well, I'm kind of like a duck. It's like water off my back, like I just let it go. And I said to her, that's actually not how this works. I said, it's more like moss. It builds up when you don't address things, and then it becomes crippling, right? It just keeps building and building, and then eventually you explode. And I said, that's not, if this is going to work, you've got to tell me, when things are bothering you. And she, for example, has this approach where she needs some space. So when something comes up, like I'm the kind of person, I'm like, well, let's talk about it. And she's like, no, I'm not ready to talk about it. And so I would say, look, when you're ready, like come and talk to me, but let's just make sure that we address it. And I think I also learned that partly from my parents who, when they would conflict, my dad actually would get in his car and go for a drive. And I think he was trying to give himself a little space to process and manage the emotional side of things. He claims that when he got back, they would talk. My mother, not so much. She sort of was like, well, sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. So I think part of it is communication. Like it's a critical component, but it's also realizing that conflicts are going to arise and you have to sit down and try to work that through. And I think for me, it was also very important to try to model that kind of behavior for my kids so that they saw that, we'd be sitting around the dinner table and we'd conflict and we would have to talk about what does that look like and why are you upset and why does this bother you? People don't do that enough. They avoid those conversations because they think that they may be too upsetting or, one of the challenges that we have is that in our minds, we create a whole story of what's going to happen before we have the conversation. So we sort of talk ourselves out of ever having that conversation, right? You say, well, if I were to raise this, she's going to get upset and then she's going to yell at me and then I'm going to yell back. And before we know it, this is going to escalate out of control. So I'm just not going to do it. I'll just leave it and I'll get over it. We'll get over it and whatever.
And the
And
moss will grow.
the moss will grow. And then eventually I think what you find is that, you know, people have no real pattern for how to handle the challenges that come up. And, I think it's interesting because I kind of believe that we say lots of things to family that we wouldn't say to anybody else, and because we think that they'll just forgive us. And I kind of feel like we need to be more thoughtful with family when it comes to this kind of thing, that you don't just get to say whatever you want because they're family and they'll be there. You need to be respectful of whatever relationships you have. So I think a very big, I mean, there are from, to your point, there are a lot of financial dimensions that cause divorce. Life is difficult. It's getting harder to manage from a financial point of view. And, in the world we live in with rising costs and everything, all those things hit hard. And, sometimes you don't have anywhere to turn. And so I think people sometimes turn against the other because they don't know how to do things differently. And I think that's what's so important, is that you have to invest in learning to negotiate and learning to deal with conflict. Otherwise, you fall prey to your basic instincts, which typically are very defensive. And, we're always focused on how to protect ourselves and not how to, find creative ways of living better together.
I love that, Josh. I love that, Josh. I really love the fact that you mentioned we have to be more thoughtful with family, because it kind of, to me, it kind of connects with the fact that compromising is lazy. Sometimes with those closest to you, you end up taking them for advantage, taking them, and you don't give them maybe the respect that they deserve and value the relationship as deeply as maybe it should be. So, Josh, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. I know you've already said a lot and already added a lot of value to the listeners, but I wanted to kind of synthesize it a little bit. From your perspective, what are the three biggest misconceptions everyday people have about negotiations and conflict resolution?
Okay, that's a good question. So I think the first one is the first and primary one is that this is not a win-lose endeavor. And if you go into it with that mindset, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're always going to be looking for, how am I going to gain, and how I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to lose. And the problem is, and I often ask this question, for example, in the trainings I do with companies, I'll say, tell me the percentage of your negotiations that are one-time scenarios where you're going to negotiate with this person and you never see them again, right? And how many are with the same people or same company or organizations over and over again? And the answer is typically 10 to 15% are one-time negotiations. So 85 to 90%, I'm negotiating with the same people over and over again. So the key is that you have to develop and build relationships. That, frankly, is the key, in my mind, to most things in life. One time my daughter said to me, what do you've done okay in life. Like, what do you think was, you know, underpinning your success? And I said, honestly, it feels to me like it's really that I understand and I value relationships and I build them and I grow them and I really work hard at developing them. So, that's one important dimension here. So the second, I think, sort of mistake or misperception that people have is, again, that this is all, dealing with conflict or negotiating requires a great sacrifice, requires compromising something that's really, really important to you. And I'm not going to say that compromise may not be part of the deal at some point. But here's what I will tell you. And a number of years ago, maybe I think 4 or 5 years ago, I did an interview with Forbes India. And the title of the article was "Compromise should be the last stop on the train, not the first one." And what I was trying to tell people was, when you negotiate, you should be thinking, do I really understand what's going on here? And if not, how do I try to figure that out? And can I fully understand the underlying interests and needs of the person that I'm dealing with? And can I also be very clear about what it is that my goals are? And when you have that orientation, you're going to explore. And what often happens, and I've always amazed by this, I do a lot of mediating as well with people. And I'm always amazed by the fact that when we get down to these underlying needs and interests, not a lot of compromise is necessary, because you're realizing that what somebody actually needs is a little bit different than what they said they did at the outset. And a lot of those underlying interests are what I would call intangible interests, meaning the things that make us human, right? If you feel disrespected, then the only way out of that is to show respect to someone. And no amount of compromise is going to help you when you feel disrespected. So I genuinely feel like people rely way too much on compromise and they move to it very quickly. What I will say to folks is, keep compromise in your back pocket. Make it the very last thing that you think about doing. Instead, think about creative problem solving and things like that. And the third aspect of this is that because we're always working with incomplete information, when you and I sit down, Mustafa, you know something that I don't, I know something that you don't. And so part of the challenge is, can we figure out how to share that information? Because when we do, our behavior begins to make sense. But what that means when we are always working with incomplete information is that we need to expect the unexpected, and we need to be flexible and adaptable in our approach to what's going on. In most negotiations, for example, you're going to say something that I didn't even realize was part of the negotiation, right? And that's what I often call the freak out moment, where people kind of lose it because they walked in with a plan, right? And they thought their plan was going to be great and they were going to do A, B, and C and get to where they wanted to go. But that's not how negotiation works, because there are things that you know that I don't, right? So I have to go in saying to myself, I'm fairly sure at some point Mustafa is going to say something that I didn't realize was part of this negotiation or part of this conflict. And so I'm going to have to deal with that information in the moment. And I'm going to have to think about, what do I do with this? Sometimes when we're not sure how to react and respond to new information like that, we talk about an idea of kind of stepping away and doing what's called going to the balcony, which means that you temporarily step back to kind of process that new information and think about what you're going to do with that. What kind of constraints does that put on you? Or what kind of an opportunity does that create, right? You might share something, and I might think to myself, well, if that's what's really important to Mustafa, I can do that. It's not a problem. And maybe I'll give you a quick example of what I mean. So I do a lot of work with engineers. Okay. And one instance, there's a project manager at an engineering firm who reached out to me and said, hey, I took your class. I could really use talking to you because I'm having a very difficult conflict. So we got on the phone and he told me that he was dealing with a project manager from a city. And the project manager, they ran into a problem with a wastewater treatment plant issue. And he came up with a solution that he knew would work. It's based on kind of very new technology and things like that. And the project manager from the city kept saying no every time he put this solution in front of him. And the project manager from the city was not that savvy. He was a pretty new guy out of college. But the project manager I was working with kept saying, I cannot figure out why he's saying no. So we dug in and we talked more, and we talked a little bit about what might be really motivating him. And he said, I think he might not have the knowledge that he needs to kind of go back to, the city council and explain why we're making this change. And the other challenge was that the project manager from the city was a conflict avoider. So he didn't want to meet in person. They were only using email. And the project manager I was working with couldn't get him to meet. So eventually he said, look, it's really critical we come together. And they did come together. And eventually the project manager I was working with, got the other project manager to admit that he didn't have the knowledge to go back to the city council and explain why they were doing this. And if they started asking questions, he was worried he wouldn't have the knowledge because he was 2 years out of college, university, right? So the project manager said, listen, I'm happy to come with you to the city council meeting and help you explain why we're making this change. We've run into this problem, et cetera, and answer any questions and make you look good in the process. And once he said that, the other guy said, okay, great. That's perfect. So he was motivated by a fear of being embarrassed and a fear of not knowing the answers to the questions that the city council was going to ask him. And so when the project manager took that off the table and said, happy to help you to do that, they solved the problem, right? So that's an example of, there's no compromise there, right? It's an example of understanding why people are doing something and then addressing that underlying fear or concern.
Josh, this is a very powerful story, and I appreciate you sharing it. Throughout this, there was a lot of value that you provided. I just want to summarize it for the audience. Number one, it was develop strategic relationships. Number two, it was that the intangible interests are so crucial. Number three was that we need to be flexible because we don't have all the information. So it felt like in that example, in that anecdotal story, Josh, it felt like there's a fear of looking dumb. There's the idea that we don't know what we don't know. There's this elephant in the room that we're not aware of. How often do you see that come up in negotiations and conflict resolution?
A lot more than people would like to admit. We spend much of our lives protecting our reputation, right? And so people often do things to protect themselves. And if they don't know how to do something, they would rather say no than expose themselves or put themselves out there. So I think, what what people ought to really be thinking about when they get into a difficult conflict or a difficult negotiation and they can't figure out what's going on, or it's proving to be difficult, think to that intangible realm, because that is what motivates us. As one of my students likes to say, if we could just take emotions out of all of this, it would be a whole lot easier, right? And we can't. Human beings are not robots, although with AI we're getting closer and closer, right? But the reality is that those are the things that really worry and concern us, and much of the time we're motivated by managing our ego and protecting ourselves. I see it a lot, and I also do a lot of coaching and advising, and one of the biggest challenges is helping people to let go of their ego and to not think that if they were to go down a certain road that it makes them look weak or something like that. To me, being transparent when needed, and sharing information is the only way out of these difficult kinds of situations. But part of it is, and a big mistake I see quite frequently is that when people get caught in cycles, they always think the other person or the other side should be the one to break that cycle. And I try to share with folks that, look, you're better off modeling the behavior that you're looking for and not waiting forever for someone to knock on the door. Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years, and he came out and reached out to F.W. de Klerk and said, we need to find a solution to this conflict in South Africa. And a journalist said, why would you do that? You've been in prison for 27 years. Like, why didn't you wait till he knocked on your door? And Mandela said, listen, someone has to knock on the door first. I've, been waiting a long time for all of this. So, like, let's get at it already and try to solve this problem that's plaguing our country. So I think those things are essential in managing this, and to try to overcome your fear. One of the interesting things that I notice is that when people actually deal with a conflict, they'll come around and say to me, you know what? It was a lot worse in my head. I wish I had just dove in originally and dealt with it, because it wasn't that bad and we found a way forward.
I love that simple summary, Josh. I think sometimes the mind is more overreactive than we realize. Josh, do you feel like there's a similarity between how people avoid confrontation, avoid conflict, avoid negotiating, and how they approach their money?
I do. Yeah. It's interesting because the negotiations around money, um, are one of the biggest challenges for people. I've had a lot of people say to me, I'm happy to negotiate about time or about this or about that, but when it comes to money and salary and things like that, it's much, much harder. And I think it's because people are worried about being seen as greedy, or from a cultural point of view, for many, many years and even still today, people from a minority background or women, they're questioned differently when they ask and when they raise those kinds of questions. So I do think negotiating and dealing with conflict related to money has a certain dynamic. Of course, it's a dynamic that we've created. Again, it's how we think about it. And, it's always interesting to me. A lot of the students that I have in my program will say, I have no problem negotiating on behalf of others. It's really when I have to negotiate for myself and feeling like I deserve this. And it's okay for me to ask that. A lot of the people who I deal with, they struggle with assertiveness. And so, but I say to them, look, you can't be an effective negotiator if you're not willing to ask. And you have to get out of your head the notion that you don't deserve this somehow, because that's the story that a lot of people tell themselves.
So Josh, help me dive a bit deeper on this, right? If I'm applying for that job, I get that salary offer. In theory, I know I should counter just to counter, but for whatever reason, I don't feel comfortable.
Mhm.
What does that process look like for me to get educated, figure out how to talk to, the hiring manager? What does the whole workflow look like in your opinion to
Sure.
for me, somebody who is not comfortable, to actually have that conversation and actually get that salary increase or more benefits or whatever?
Yeah. So first of all, it's really, it begins and maybe even ends with preparation. And there's a way to prepare in negotiation, and there's a way not to. So we talked a little bit about this before. If you develop a plan, you're going to fail. It's a false sense of comfort. But what you want to do, you have to, Dwight Eisenhower said plans are useless, but planning is everything. And what he meant was that and he was talking about war, but to me, it's similar to negotiation and dealing with conflict, which is a plan doesn't help you because of the lack of information challenge that we have. Right? But engaging in contingency planning and saying, okay, here's the goal that I have. What are the different ways that I can get there? It's always great to have 3 or 4 avenues to achieve the same goal, so that if you start down one road and it's blocked, the other side says, yeah, we're not doing that. You have other ways to go. So I think preparation is an essential one. And particularly when it comes to money and resources, you always want to be looking at what's the industry standard for this. So when I go into a job interview, like I want to know, here's the salary that is commensurate with my experience and for this position. And I want to be really clear with somebody about that. And people have to be very careful about a concept called anchoring. So anchoring is when, for example, an employer might put out a number, or anybody puts out a first number. It's very easy for us to get anchored by that number. In other words, we start negotiating from whatever they've put forth. So if they offer you 75,000 for a position, you might say, well, I really, with my experience, I really feel like 80 is more fair, right? When in fact, if you did your homework, you would find that the industry standard for that position is $100,000. And so the way out of that problem is not to negotiate around the anchor, but to say, as I was doing my homework for this particular interview and for this opportunity, I found that the average is 100,000. So could you help me understand why 75,000 is reasonable? And so what you're doing is you're sort of dropping a counter anchor in the process. But the other thing that I would mention, and I think is very important, and as you might imagine, I get asked a lot about job negotiations and things like that. And the one thing that I also try to tell people is I want you to think about all the things that you value, that you really care about, because that's actually what makes a good deal in negotiation great. When you can figure out what people really care about. And if you think about a job, right, we have a lot of things that we value that go along with that. Flex time, maybe telecommuting, maybe you live an hour away and you don't feel like driving in every day. Maybe you have kids and you need to take them to daycare. So flex time becomes really valuable. What do those benefits look like? Is there an opportunity for professional development and growth? Those are the kind of things that you want to ask for as part of any job negotiation, and not just salary. Too often what we do is we focus solely on the dollars and cents of any kind of scenario, and we leave out things that would actually be of great benefit to us.
So, Josh, help me understand, right? You mentioned earlier in the conversation that compromising is lazy. You're mentioning a lot of wisdom with respect to job negotiations, and you're mentioning maybe a lot of people focus on the salary. Do you feel like that's a bit lazy? Do you feel like the process of preparing, as critical as it is maybe overstepped because it requires work and people just focus on the number just because it's easy?
Typically, yeah. I mean, first of all, most people, I mean, if you haven't had any training in, or education in negotiation, that's what people do is they'll just focus in on the number, and they won't know whether they should make a first offer or wait, or, other dimensions and dynamics that are involved. You know, Look, the one thing I would say that I think is really important for people to keep in mind is negotiation is not about reaching agreement. That's not the goal of negotiation. The goal of negotiation is to meet your objective as best as possible. So when I sit down, I'm thinking to myself, my goal is to get this job at this salary range because it's reasonable based on the industry standard. And if the other side comes back and says, well, we're not doing that or we can't do that, I might be willing to get creative and say, well, tell me what your constraints are. Could you do a bonus? Because a lot of times people are worried about precedent. If I give you a higher salary than I'm giving somebody who's already working for me, well, how could I do that, right? That's a problem. But what you can do is you could give someone a bonus, which is not, a precedent shattering kind of deal. And this is where, again, this is where creativity comes into play, because I think if you can get somebody into a conversation about the things that are important to you, you might find a creative solution that's better than just talking about the dollars and cents. But yeah, I think the answer to your question is yes. I think people, they get so fixated on the money that they lose sight of other things that have a lot of value for them. And again, you know, I think a lot of this is people just don't know how to do it effectively. And it's not a criticism. It's like anything, when we learn, it's a learned skill. That's why I teach it. And so, and what's interesting is when the students come out of, for example, the introduction to negotiation class that I teach, they say my mind was blown because I thought negotiation was about manipulation and win lose and all this kind of stuff. And you're putting in front of me a different way of approaching things, a way that for most people, where you're really trying to understand the underlying needs and things like that, is a far more comfortable way to negotiate, and one that they want to engage in. They won't walk away from the table feeling like they took advantage of somebody, and the next time around it's going to be their turn to take advantage of me and things like that.
I love that, Josh. I love how you shined a light on maybe some more misconceptions people have. So, Josh, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned or alluded to a little bit about AI and how things will change and maybe will become less emotional. Help me understand, do you feel like ChatGPT can completely change the dynamic of negotiating and conflict resolution?
I don't think it can help. I don't think it can completely change the dynamic. I think it can absolutely help you to prepare in an effective way. And I think it can help you to do the kind of research that you need to do. Look, one of the challenges that people have is that they're embarrassed to ask for things. And that's a nice feature of ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, right? Which is I can just put this information in and get it back without feeling like I need to be embarrassed in some way, shape, or form. So I think it's a great tool. I'm at the university where I teach. I'm part of an augmented intelligence lab. So we're talking about the interface of AI and humans and how does that collaboration work. And I think that's what you're really aiming for. I don't think AI will, well, okay, I'm going to hesitate to say that. I was going to say I don't think AI will ever replace humans at the negotiating table. And I generally believe that. But I do think AI will enhance the experience and help people in a lot of ways that it's currently, beginning to do. Right now, a lot of the AI contribution to negotiation, for example, is around bots. And a lot of companies like Walmart and others have been using it very successfully to manage small disputes and things like that. The challenge that I'm seeing is that the more complicated situations where you have many parties and you have lots of interests and underlying issues and things like that, that's a hard thing for AI to manage effectively at the moment. But you can to absolutely use it to prepare. You can absolutely use it to sort of understand what went wrong as well. Like if you can say, hey, I was in this negotiation and looked like we were going to reach an agreement and we didn't, and I'm trying to understand why, like what might have been some reasons why that could have been the case, right? And ChatGPT will give you a list of maybe there was a personal issue that got in the way or things along those lines. So I do think, I mean, I was at a conference last year at Harvard and MIT on AI and negotiation. And so it's absolutely being used. And I think it has the ability to really help you from that informational point of view as you prepare to find the right industry standard for something or to do that background research. I want people to understand that preparation is absolutely essential when it comes to negotiation and dealing with conflict. And I think this is where AI can really help because these large language models are able to pull together information in an amazingly fast way and will save you a tremendous amount of time sorting through all that kind of stuff. So I think that's where right now there's a huge benefit that AI brings to the table, and it can help you to manage as you go. And by the way, the last thing I'll say is, it can also be really helpful when you're negotiating virtually. So if you're negotiating via email or with other kinds of things, you could take an email that you get from the other side and put it in chat GPT and say, give me an appropriate response with my goal being this, right? And so for folks who are not always great at wording and things along those lines, it's another place where it can help you to say things in the most effective manner. So there's absolutely a role for AI. It is here to stay. It's only going to get more significant. But as I said, I think that augmented sort of AI is the way to really think about this because human beings won't go away in the end.
Thanks, Josh, for that insightful response. I guess, if we were to take everything that we've been speaking about for the last 45 minutes or so and kind of sum it up with respect to money and negotiating, how does this collaboration or AI implementation work if it's a blind spot for the person?
Well, I mean, AI, as you probably know, I mean, it tells you, it responds to the question that you ask it, right? And there's a saying that I've learned: garbage in, garbage out, right? If you ask a bad question, you're going to get a bad answer. So what I think people really need to be doing with AI, so that they don't run into the problem that you're talking about, is keep asking the question differently, keep honing and refining the question so that you're actually getting the most appropriate response and you're really working it. And there are settings within AI. For example, there's an inquisitive setting. So instead of giving you answers, it's asking you questions. Well, why do you think that? Right? And it maybe forces you to challenge some of your assumptions. And assumptions, by the way, are sort of the silent killers of effective negotiation and dealing with conflict, because you might make an assumption. I don't know you made it. It's driving and guiding your story, right? But it's pushing us further away because you're working off of that assumption and I'm not. So AI can also, I think, really help you to check those assumptions and to help you to sort of stay on the same page with the other person that you're dealing with.
Joshua, I love it. Great response. I think you touched on a lot of different silent prompt engineering hacks for people to implement while using ChatGPT or any of these tools. So, Josh, last question of the day, maybe the most important one. If I'm listening to this podcast, if I'm listening to this episode and I'm finding immense value, what is the best way for me to reach out to you to learn more about the products, services that you offer?
Sure. The best way is to go to my website, which is www.joshuanweiss.com. I'm guessing if folks Google me, they'll find me out there some way. And that's got all the books that I've written. I've written 4 children's books to help kids learn how to negotiate and deal with conflict as well, because I think that's really where we should be starting. Not that we don't want to work with the old fogies, but we want to get to kids so that they can realize that throughout the course of their life, they're going to have to deal with this, and there's a way to do that. So, but also other services, the training and the public speaking and the coaching and the advising and things like that are all there. Yeah.
Awesome. So, what we'll do is we'll include that in the show notes. Once again, Joshua, thanks for the conversation today. It's been a reminder that negotiation isn't just for a boardroom, it's a skill that's ubiquitous, like you mentioned. It impacts every part of our life. You've shown us that when you learn to slow down, understand the motives, and approach conflict with clarity instead of fear, you unlock more data, you get more answers, and you're able to make more informed, better decisions, build healthier relationships, and ultimately gain stronger financial freedom. Dr. Joshua Rice, thanks again for sharing your wisdom. If this episode gave you tools or confidence, follow MyFinJourney and share it with someone else who's looking to grow and navigate tough conversations or make an important decision. Thanks again, Josh.
You're
Bye bye.
welcome, Mustafa. Take care.